Get comfortable. If you haven't already, find your spot, whatever that looks like for you. Pillow adjusted, blanket pulled up, phone face down somewhere nearby. We're going to be here for a while, and that's kind of the whole point. Tonight we're talking about South Park. Not all of it. That would take weeks, honestly. But a specific slice of it, the part that doesn't usually make it into the anniversary specials or the best of lists. The part that involves banned episodes, death threats, an entire country erasing the show from the internet. Religious organizations spending years trying to get single episodes pulled from circulation. A network censoring its own show while the show was actively making fun of censorship, and a former voice cast member whose departure may or may not have actually been his own decision. South Park has been airing since 1997. That's 28 seasons as of 2025, which puts it in pretty rare company. Most shows that run that long do so by becoming comfortable furniture. Familiar, uncontroversial, pleasant. South Park went the other direction. For most of its run, it was in some kind of fight with a regulatory body, with a government, with a religion, with one of its own cast members, with a country that contains 1.4 billion people. There's something I want to be upfront about before we get started. This is not a video designed to keep you anxious or awake. That's not what tonight is for. We're going to move through this material at whatever pace feels right, and if your eyelids start getting heavy, somewhere around the Scientology section or the Catholic League campaign, that's entirely fine. The show isn't going anywhere. The scandals are well documented. You can come back to any of it. What I'm interested in, more than the individual controversies, is what they add up to. What does it mean that a cartoon, a paper cutout cartoon, made by 2 college students on a $1,000 budget from an executive's holiday card commission, has been formally banned by multiple countries, had 5 episodes permanently removed from streaming by its own network, triggered security increases at a major cable company's offices in New York City, and survived every single one of those things to still be airing new episodes as of 2025? That's the question underneath all of it, not, was this offensive? The answer to that is obviously yes, frequently. But why, when a show is this consistently in trouble with this many different kinds of institutions, does it keep going? What does a show need to have that South Park apparently has to survive everything that has been thrown at it? I think the answer has something to do with the specific way Parker and Stone built the thing. But we'll get there. And what makes it interesting, what makes it worth sitting with on a quiet night like this, is that the show wasn't just causing trouble for the sake of it. Most of the time, there was a point underneath the chaos. Sometimes the point landed cleanly. Sometimes it got buried under the controversy before anyone could read it. And sometimes the fight itself became the point. If you want to subscribe, now's a good time. It helps the channel more than you might think, and it keeps nights like this coming. But no pressure. Let's just get into it. We'll start at the very beginning, before the show was a show, before Comedy Central knew what they had, before anyone had heard of Trey Parker or Matt Stone. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado at Boulder in the early 1990s. Parker was studying music and film. Stone was in economics, but spending most of his time doing film stuff too. They were the kind of people who made things for the pleasure of making them. Short films, sketches, whatever they could put together with the equipment they had access to. In 1992, they made something. It was a very short, very crude animated piece using paper cutout characters. The animation was basic in a way that was almost deliberately so, not trying to be sophisticated, just trying to get a joke across. The premise was simple. Jesus and Frosty the Snowman got into a fight. There were 4 small children watching this happen, and one of them wore an orange parka pulled so tight you could barely see his face. His name in this version was Kenny. The short has a title now, Jesus versus Frosty. But at the time, it was just a thing Parker and Stone made and showed to people. It didn't go anywhere. They went back to school. 3 years later, in 1995, something slightly more organized happened. A Fox television executive named Brian Graydon had seen some of Parker and Stone's student film work and liked it. He approached them with what was, in retrospect, one of the stranger creative commissions in recent entertainment history. He gave them $1,000 and asked them to make an animated Christmas card he could send to his friends. This was just a thing executives did sometimes, a novelty item, a party favor. Nobody was expecting anything remarkable. What Parker and Stone made was a short called The Spirit of Christmas, Jesus vs. Santa. The paper cutout style was back, slightly more polished. The four boys were back, with their names now closer to the final versions: Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. And the premise was that Jesus and Santa Claus got into a fight in a parking lot because they were both trying to claim ownership of Christmas, which ended with the boys deciding to celebrate Christmas for no good reason at all, which was sort of the point. Brian Graydon sent it to his friends as promised. Those friends sent it to their friends, and then, this is the part that seems almost impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't online in the mid-1990s. It started moving through the early internet, email attachments, Usenet groups, primitive file sharing. The short went, in the language we'd use now, viral. People who had absolutely no connection to the entertainment industry were watching it on their work computers and forwarding it to everyone they knew. Comedy Central noticed. Comedy Central in 1995 was a young cable channel still trying to figure out what it was. They had some sketch comedy, some stand-up, and a lot of programming that hadn't quite found an audience. They approached Parker and Stone and asked, could this become a show? The answer was yes, apparently. It took about 2 years. But on August 13th, 1997, the first episode of South Park aired on Comedy Central. Cartman gets an anal probe. A small alien visits a fictional Colorado mountain town and abducts one of the children. The alien's primary interest is that child's digestive system. The episode involves a piece of alien technology that fires lasers when it is triggered by, let's say, flatulence. I want to be honest about something. The very first episode of South Park is not subtle about what kind of show this is going to be. There's a dead child in the first few minutes. There are jokes about bodily functions that would have cleared a writer's room at almost any other network. The language is, or there is no other word for it, extremely rude. The animation style, while clearly more polished than the Christmas card, is still visibly primitive. These are flat paper figures with stiff movements and expressions that don't change much. And yet 1.3 million people watched it on a cable channel that most people's parents hadn't heard of. For cable in 1997, that was a strong number. By the 10th episode of the first season, the Nielsen rating had jumped from 1.3 to 6.4. Comedy Central, which had around 9 million subscribers at the start of 1997, ended that year with closer to 50 million. South Park had not done that alone, but it had done a significant portion of it. Parker and Stone were 27 and 26 years old, respectively, when the show premiered. They had made the Christmas card, done the pilot, and now found themselves running one of the most watched shows on cable, with essentially no traditional television experience between them. What they did have was a very clear sense of what they found funny, almost no sense of what they weren't allowed to say, and a production process they had basically invented themselves. It's worth understanding what Comedy Central actually was in 1997 because it changes the texture of the whole story. The network had been formed in 1991 from a merger of two previous cable channels, HBO's The Comedy Channel and Viacom's HATV Comedy Network, and had spent most of its early years trying to establish an identity beyond just being the channel that shows stand-up comedy reruns. Its original programming was sparse, its budget was small, its subscriber count was respectable but not dominant. When South Park premiered, Comedy Central was a channel that people had but didn't necessarily seek out. The South Park effect on Comedy Central's subscriber numbers is one of those things that becomes a footnote in industry history, but was genuinely significant at the time, going from roughly 9 million households to roughly 50 million over the course of a single year, with South Park as the primary driver, essentially remade the channel's business. It transformed Comedy Central from a niche cable outlet into something with actual market weight. The executives who had taken the risk on two unknown young filmmakers were vindicated at a scale they probably hadn't expected. But that success created its own complications. When you are suddenly the show responsible for a network's identity and subscriber base, your leverage is different. Your cancellation is more consequential. Your fights with the network are harder to resolve with a simple, "We'll find something else." South Park had, within a year of premiering, become too important to Comedy Central for Comedy Central to easily manage. The tail was already wagging the dog, and both parties knew it. This context explains why Comedy Central's early relationship with the show's controversies was so complicated. They were simultaneously fielding complaints from advocacy groups, managing nervous conversations with advertisers, watching the ratings climb, and realizing that the show causing all their problems was also the show making them relevant. Pulling it would solve one set of problems and create a much larger one. Not pulling it meant navigating every new controversy as it arrived, without a clear playbook, making decisions that were simultaneously business decisions and editorial ones. Parker and Stone, meanwhile, were learning the rhythms of weekly production at a pace most television creators don't experience. They were writing, animating, recording, mixing, and delivering a finished 22-minute episode in 6 days, every week, for however many episodes were in the order. This schedule, which would have broken most production operations, was something they had essentially engineered on purpose. The point was speed, the point was relevance, the point was being able to comment on something that happened on Monday and have it animated and broadcast by the following week. The cost of that speed, which Parker and Stone have acknowledged in various interviews, was that you don't have time to rethink everything. You write the thing, you make the thing, you put it out. If the thing turns out to have a problem, a timing issue, an unexpected collision with a real event, a joke that lands differently than anticipated, you find out when it airs, not before. The 6-day cycle was a feature and a bug simultaneously, and the history of South Park's controversies is partly a history of what happens when you choose speed over caution every single week for 28 years. That production process is worth understanding because it explains a lot about how South Park continued to function for the next 3 decades. Parker and Stone wrote, produced, and directed almost everything themselves. They kept the studio small and in-house. And they set up a production cycle, essentially 6 days from concept to finished episode. That meant they could respond to current events in a way no other animated show could. A news story on Monday could be a finished, aired episode by the following Wednesday. This speed is both why the show became culturally significant and why it became a problem so quickly. When you can turn a cultural moment into a cartoon in less than a week, you are always going to be right on top of whatever is sensitive, whatever is raw, whatever people are still arguing about. You don't have the cushion of time that most production schedules build in, that period where someone can pull you aside and say, maybe let's sit on this one. The first complaints arrived before the first season was over. Parents groups were unhappy with the language. School districts were issuing memos. Opinion columns were asking what Comedy Central was thinking, giving these two men a television show. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog group that we'll keep running into throughout this whole story, had South Park on their radar within months of the premiere. What's interesting about this early period of complaints is how familiar the arguments were, even though the show itself was genuinely new. The concerns being raised that explicit content on cable television was corrupting children, that language and crude humor had no place in entertainment aimed at younger audiences, that the network had a responsibility to its viewers that it was abdicating, were the same concerns being raised about other media at exactly the same time. Video games were being hauled before Congress, music with explicit lyrics was being debated in the Senate. The internet was raising alarm about unregulated content reaching children. South Park arrived into this already charged environment as a lightning rod that was, in some ways, almost too perfect for the moment. It was a cartoon, and which meant children were considered its primary audience, regardless of the cable channel, regardless of the content, regardless of the clearly adult sensibility of almost everything in it. The fact that it was animated made the complaints feel more urgent to parents' groups than if it had been a live-action comedy with identical content. Animation meant children, children meant danger. Parker and Stone found this maddening in a specific way. They were not making a children's show. They had never intended to make a children's show. The show was full of references that only adults would understand, arguments about adult subjects, and a sensibility that was recognizably shaped by the kind of media consumption you do in your late teens and early 20s. But the format, cartoon, primary colors, children as central characters, triggered a set of assumptions that the content itself could never entirely dislodge. This is a tension that never fully resolved in the show's history. South Park was always, in some part of the cultural conversation, being treated as a children's program by critics who objected to it. And it was always in the part of the conversation that the show itself was having, operating as a piece of adult satire that happened to feature children as its primary viewpoint characters. Neither framing was entirely wrong. Both framings missed something about what the show actually was. Comedy Central was watching all of this with what appears from the outside to have been a combination of nervousness and quiet delight. The complaints were real. The numbers were also real. For a young cable channel, the numbers won. And Parker and Stone, for their part, seemed genuinely unbothered. Not in a performed way, in a way that suggests they simply did not find the complaints very interesting. They had made a show they wanted to make. People were watching it. The end. That attitude, untroubled, direct, genuinely unbothered by the machinery of controversy, would define how they handled almost every fight the show got into for the next 25 years. The Parents Television Council is an organization founded in 1995 by a media activist named L. Brent Bozell III. Its purpose, broadly, was to push back against what Bozell and his supporters saw as a decline in the quality and decency of American television. In the late 1990s, they were particularly focused on anything that had to do with sexuality, profanity, violence against children, or content that seemed designed to undermine traditional family values. South Park, on arrival, ticked essentially every box on that list. The PTC's method was consistent and organized. They would watch shows, document specific, objectionable moments with timestamps and quotes, write them up into formal complaints and press releases, and then distribute those complaints to advertisers, to regulators at the FCC, and to the press. They were good at it. They had been going after other shows for years before South Park appeared, and they had a track record of actually affecting things. Advertisers pulling spots, networks issuing disclaimers, the occasional early cancellation. But South Park presented a specific problem for the PTC's model. The show was on cable, not broadcast. Cable was regulated differently. The FCC's indecency rules, which gave the watchdog group some of its leverage, applied to broadcast television, your ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. Comedy Central was cable. The rules were different, and the penalties for pushing the line were essentially non-existent compared to what a network could face. This meant the PTC's primary effective tool against South Park was advertiser pressure. If you can't use the government, use the advertisers. And in the early years, this worked to some extent. A few companies pulled their spots after PTC campaigns. Comedy Central had some nervous conversations with sponsors. But the ratings made those conversations easier. The shows that followed South Park on Comedy Central also benefited from its audience. The whole block was performing. That made it very hard to argue for pulling the lead act. Inside the show itself, Parker and Stone were doing something more interesting than just causing offense. They were, even in those early seasons, threading jokes that had an actual point underneath them. And the clearest early example of this was an episode called Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which aired in September of 1997 during the show's first season. They were, even in those early seasons, threading jokes that had an actual point underneath them. And the clearest early example of this was an episode called Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which aired in September of 1997 during the show's first season. The episode's setup is simple. Stan's dog, Sparky, turns out to be gay. This is deeply upsetting to Stan, who's worried about what it means for him, how people will see him, whether Sparky can still be a good dog if he's a gay dog. Then Stan meets a man named Big Gay Al, cheerful, flamboyant, kind, who runs a sanctuary for animals rejected by their owners for being gay. Al takes Stan on a tour of the place, and through the tour, Stan slowly comes to understand that there is nothing wrong with his dog, that Sparky is fine, that the problem was never Sparky. The episode is very warm, Big Gay Al is written as a genuinely good person. The show doesn't make the joke at Al's expense or at the expense of gay people generally. The joke, to the extent there is one, is at Stan's initial discomfort. By the end of the episode, Stan has made peace with his dog, and his understanding of the world is slightly larger than it was before. GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which monitors how LGBTQ people are represented in media, gave the episode a GLAAD Media Award in 1998. I find this detail genuinely interesting and a little funny, not in a mean way, but in a you could not have predicted this way. The show that had parents groups furious at it within weeks of premiere won an award from GLAAD in its first season. That's not nothing, and it complicates the easy narrative that South Park was simply a machine for making people angry. It was making specific people angry. Others found it recognizable, honest, occasionally kind. The same season had an episode called Death that touched on assisted suicide. A 79-year-old man named Eric Cartman, no relation to the child, asks the boys to help him die because his body is failing him and he wants it to end. The episode treats this seriously enough that the comedy is mostly somewhere else in the plot, and the old man's situation is handled with some actual care. This also drew complaints, different complaints from the Big Gay Al ones, more about the subject matter than the treatment. But it established something that would remain true about South Park for decades. The show's actual arguments were often more considered than the controversy around them suggested. In 1998, the show reached a cultural saturation point that's almost hard to describe now. South Park was everywhere. T-shirts with the boys' faces, backpacks, keychains. Beavis and Butthead had done something similar a few years earlier, and this felt like that, but bigger. Kids were wearing South Park merchandise to school and getting sent home for it. Parents were calling it disgusting while their children watched it after school. Teachers were writing memos about it. Nighttime news magazine segments were doing concerned pieces with titles like, "Is South Park Crossing a Line?" with footage of the cartoon playing over worried commentary. The show's creators watched all of this with what appears to have been detached amusement. Parker did give interviews during this period. He talked about the show in terms of what he found funny, what he was trying to say, what he thought was true about the world. He rarely engaged with the criticism on its own terms, not dismissively exactly, but as if the mechanism of organized outrage was simply not the most interesting thing about the situation. Comedy Central was learning something during these early years that would take most of television a long time to understand. The complaints were not hurting the ratings. In some cases, the complaints were helping the ratings. Every PTC press release mentioning South Park by name was, in a non-trivial sense, an advertisement. Every newspaper column asking whether the show had gone too far was a reason for someone who hadn't watched it yet to tune in. This dynamic, where the controversy generates the audience rather than depleting it, would define the show's relationship with criticism for most of its run, and it made the traditional tools of organized opposition essentially useless. You can't boycott your way to cancellation when every mention of the boycott sends new viewers to the show. The PTC had developed its strategy over years of fighting broadcast television, where the regulatory leverage was real and the advertiser relationships were more easily pressured. Cable changed the math. On cable, the FCC was not a meaningful threat. Advertisers were more numerous, more fragmented, and more willing to stay in relationships that brought them audience numbers. The PTC was doing something real with an incomplete toolkit, and it showed. What the PTC could genuinely do was create noise. Their weekly Worst Show of the Week designations, which South Park received more than any other program during its peak years, generated press coverage. That coverage often mentioned the show by name, described what made it offensive, and functioned as a reasonably detailed advertisement. The people most likely to be drawn in by hearing that a cartoon was outrageously offensive to parents were exactly the demographic South Park was most popular with. Parker and Stone have said in interviews that they read the PTC reports about their own show with genuine interest, occasionally finding that the PTC had caught things they themselves had forgotten they'd done. The relationship had a strange quality to it. The show's most organized opponent was also, inadvertently, one of its most diligent archivists. One more thing about this early period. Comedy Central, in these first few seasons, was not a passive vessel for whatever Parker and Stone wanted to make. There were internal conversations, there were notes, there were things that were changed or softened before they got to air. Parker and Stone have talked about this in interviews over the years. The early network relationship was real and involved some genuine negotiation. But the show was already establishing a pattern. Push, get pushback, hold firm, push again. Whatever Comedy Central was nervous about, whatever the PTC was organizing around, the show kept moving. The controversies weren't destinations. They were things that happened on the way to somewhere else. By the end of season 2, the show had been on the air for 2 years. It had been accused of corrupting children, promoting homosexuality, mocking religion, glorifying death, using language that shouldn't be on television, and generally making the world worse. It had also won a cable industry award for creative achievement and was the most watched original programming on Comedy Central. The 1998 South Park cultural moment is worth describing a bit more because it's easy to underestimate how completely the show saturated popular culture in that specific window. It wasn't just ratings, it was Halloween costumes, it was backyards, it was the way kids talked to each other at school. The phrase, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," had become a catchphrase in the way that only a handful of television moments actually produce. Something that moves from the TV into ordinary speech without being forced there. Teachers were fielding questions about the show from concerned parents. Youth pastors were preaching about it, school boards were discussing it, and the show's visual identity, those flat, bright, simple paper cutout figures against the Colorado snow, became one of the most recognizable things in American pop culture for a period of years. The boys' specific silhouettes, their hats, their jackets, the particular orange of Kenny's parka became instantly legible in a way that required no text label. You knew what you were looking at. This visual simplicity also meant the show's merchandise was easy to reproduce and easy to sell. South Park merchandise was everywhere in 1998. Some of it was licensed, some of it was not. The unauthorized product being sold at school sales and mall kiosks and street markets existed in quantities that suggested the cultural penetration of the show was significantly broader than the viewership numbers could fully capture. People who had never watched an episode owned South Park t-shirts. The brand had outrun the show itself. Parker and Stone were 28 years old. In 1999, South Park made a movie, which sounds simple but turned into one of the more interesting fights the show had in its first decade because making a movie means dealing with the Motion Picture Association of America. And the MPAA was not prepared for what Parker and Stone submitted. A little background on the MPAA rating system for anyone who hasn't thought about this in a while. The MPAA assigns ratings to films before they're released. G, PG, PG-13, R, and C-17. These aren't legal censorship. No one can legally force you to change your film. But in practical terms, the rating controls almost everything about whether a film can reach a mainstream audience. NC-17 means most major theater chains won't carry the film, most newspapers won't run ads for it, and most video rental stores put it in a separate section or won't stock it at all. For a wide-release animated feature from a major studio, getting an NC-17 is, functionally, death. Parker and Stone submitted their film. The MPAA came back with an NC-17. They went back, made some adjustments, resubmitted, NC-17 again. This went on 6 times, 6 rounds of the MPAA saying no, Parker and Stone making small changes, the MPAA saying no again. The film they were trying to get rated was called South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. The title itself is a joke. The plot involves the boys sneaking into a Canadian film to hear profanity, subsequently using that language themselves, and triggering a chain of events that leads to an American war with Canada, the summoning of Satan from hell, and a romantic subplot between Satan and Saddam Hussein. Kenny dies and goes to hell. Cartman has a chip installed in his brain to stop him swearing, which causes him to shoot flames when he curses. The boys form a resistance movement. The film is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily crude. It contains a song where Cartman's mother is described in terms that I'm not going to repeat here, but you can probably imagine. There are extended musical numbers about profanity, bodily functions, and the inadequacy of American military strategy. Saddam Hussein makes advances toward Satan while playing a guitar. The whole thing is presented as a kind of filthy Broadway musical. And what I find fascinating about the MPAA situation, what Parker and Stone were genuinely amused by, was the specific things the MPAA wanted changed versus what they didn't seem to care about. The MPAA was primarily focused on the verbal content, specific words, specific phrases, the frequency with which certain terms appeared. The romantic scenes between Satan and Saddam Hussein, and which are objectively extremely weird, didn't seem to generate the same level of concern. The song about Cartman's mother, which is musically cheerful and lyrically catastrophic, required multiple rounds of negotiation. The visual content, including things that are plainly more striking than a rude song, generated less friction. Parker and Stone have talked about this over the years in a way that suggests they found it genuinely confusing. The MPAA's threshold seemed to them arbitrary in a specific way, focused on words rather than ideas, on surface content rather than what anything was actually saying. They also discovered that the MPAA doesn't actually publish its standards. There's no document you can consult that tells you exactly what will get your film an NC-17 versus an R. It's a judgment call made by a board, and the reasoning given is often vague. Parker and Stone went 6 rounds and eventually got to an R rating, but the specific changes that got them there were not fully explained. What this meant in practice was that the film they released in theaters in June of 1999 was still one of the most aggressively crude animated features to receive wide mainstream distribution in American history. It's not like they had to make a sanitized version. They got to their R by making targeted adjustments, not by changing the film's character. The film made about $83 million at the global box office, which was a solid number for a mid-budget animated feature from a cable show. Critically, it was well received, particularly for the musical numbers, which were acknowledged as genuinely well-crafted even by critics who were uncomfortable with the material. Roger Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars. Ebert's review is worth a quick mention because of how he framed it. He acknowledged the film's crudeness directly and didn't minimize it. But he also wrote that the film was, underneath its surface, a genuine satire with real things to say about censorship, about American culture, about the way parents assign responsibility for their children's behavior to external sources. He treated it as a piece of work worth taking seriously on its own terms, which was not the universal critical posture at the time. There were critics who reviewed Bigger, Longer, and Uncut as an exercise in deliberate vulgarity designed to shock and nothing more. Those reviews were not entirely wrong. The film was absolutely designed to be as extreme as it could be within whatever rating it could achieve. But they missed the thing that Ebert caught, which is that the vulgarity was also an argument. The film was making the case that the anxiety around language and crude content in media was disproportionate to any actual harm the content caused. The MPAA experience, 6-round, 6 NC-17 ratings eventually landing on R, was evidence for the prosecution of that argument, not a counter to it. The fact that a film could go through 6 rounds of rejection from the official ratings body and come out the other side with an Oscar nomination for one of its songs is probably the most compressed version of the South Park story available. Official disapproval, sustained pressure, eventual accommodation, followed by recognition from the same mainstream industry that had been pushing back. That pattern would repeat itself throughout the show's history in different forms. The MPAA, the FCC, the Catholic League, governments, all of them push, none of them ultimately prevail. And the show collects the residue of each fight and keeps moving. And then Blame Canada, one of the film's songs, was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song. I want to sit with this for a second because it's the kind of thing that sounds like something you'd make up. A song from a cartoon that was repeatedly denied a rating by the MPAA, written by the creators of a show that parents' groups had been trying to shut down for 2 years, was nominated for an Oscar. Anne Robinson performed the song at the ceremony in 2000 in a dress on stage at the Shrine Auditorium. Parker and Stone attended the ceremony in full drag, dresses, wigs, makeup, and claimed to have taken acid beforehand. They didn't win. You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan won that year. But the nomination did something real. It said that the mainstream industry, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, had looked at what Parker and Stone were making and decided it deserved to be in the room with the best work being done in film. That's a harder thing to dismiss than a cable show's ratings. It added a layer of credibility that the PTC and similar groups couldn't easily argue away. More practically, what the film experience taught Parker and Stone was about limits and leverage. They had pushed, the MPAA had pushed back, they had negotiated, and they had gotten something close to what they wanted without genuinely compromising the film's identity. The process was annoying, the outcome was workable, and the lesson that the machinery of official disapproval was real but navigable would stay with them. The film also established something about the show's relationship with its own format. Bigger, longer, and uncut does things that a 22-minute cable episode can't do, both in terms of scale and in terms of the kind of sustained argument you can make when you have 80 minutes instead of 22. The musical structure of the film allowed Parker and Stone to make points about cultural anxiety, censorship, and American political response in a form that required genuine craft. The songs are not just vehicles for crude jokes, they're actually constructed with a Broadway sense of how a musical number carries an argument. Blame Canada, on the nominated song, makes a specific point about how society offloads moral responsibility for children's exposure to content onto external targets. The parents of South Park are furious at Canada for what their children have been watching. They're furious and they're organized and they're convinced that the problem is over there, not in their own households. It's the same argument the show had been making about the Parents Television Council's approach, just sung at 120 beats per minute by animated characters. Trey Parker is genuinely talented as a composer and lyricist in a way that doesn't always get acknowledged, possibly because the content makes it easy to dismiss. The musical numbers in the film, when you strip away the context, are technically accomplished. The orchestrations are real, the voice performances are real, the structure works. You could, if you chose to, listen to several of the songs and hear something that would function in a Broadway context. The content wouldn't make it to Broadway, but the construction would. This is part of what made the Oscar nomination feel simultaneously absurd and entirely defensible. The song was genuinely good. The category it was nominated in recognizes songwriting achievement. Blame Canada was a real achievement in that specific area. That it was attached to a film that had been denied a mainstream rating 6 times and that its creators attended the ceremony in drag doesn't change what the song actually is. There's one more thing about bigger, longer, and uncut in the context of what came later. The film contains a long list of things it's allowed to do that the show wasn't because cinema has different rules than cable television. Specific words, specific images, things that would have required serious negotiation on Comedy Central. Parker and Stone used that freedom. They used it extensively. And then they went back to doing the show with that knowledge now in their inventory. There is a record that South Park holds in American television that nobody has come close to breaking. It involves a single word, a single episode, and a production assistant whose entire job for several days was to sit in a room and count. The episode was called It Hits the Fan from the show's 5th season. The premise was that a fictional network drama called Cop Drama had gotten special permission to use the word shit uncensored in an upcoming episode. This sends the whole country into a tailspin. Everyone is talking about it, watching it, treating it as a major cultural event. And the whole time this fictional drama plays out, the actual South Park episode is using the actual word, uncensored, over and over. On the screen, a counter tracks the running total. The final count was 162. For context, at the time this episode aired, the word had appeared uncensored on American television exactly once before, in a carefully managed moment on NYPD Blue, a broadcast drama that had negotiated its way through years of regulatory friction to earn that single instance. It was treated at the time as a significant event. NYPD Blue had done it once. South Park did it 162 times in 22 minutes. A production assistant actually sat there and counted during production, making sure the number was accurate. Parker and Stone have mentioned this in interviews. The deliberateness of keeping a tally, of making sure the number was high enough to be the point. Now, there is a technical distinction worth understanding here, and it's actually the thing that made this legally possible. NYPD Blue aired on ABC, which is a broadcast network. It transmits over public airwaves. It's regulated by the FCC, and the FCC has real authority over what broadcast networks can air and when. Comedy Central is cable. Cable transmits through subscription services, wires, satellite, eventually fiber. And in 2001, the FCC's indecency rules did not apply to cable the way they applied to broadcast. This meant that Comedy Central airing that many uncensored instances of the word was not, strictly speaking, a regulatory violation. The FCC had no grounds to fine them. The PTC had no government mechanism to invoke. The only tool available was advertiser pressure, and in 2001, South Park was too valuable a property for that pressure to accomplish much. Parker and Stone's argument for the episode, to the extent they made one publicly, was essentially the same argument the episode itself was making. The fictional drama in It Hits the Fan is treated as a national event because the country has decided to make it one. The word itself, the episode suggests, has no power that the culture hasn't given it. The moral panic around bad language is more revealing than the language. If you say the word that many times in a single episode, it either destroys civilization, which it didn't, or it makes the point that civilization was not actually threatened by it. What I like about this episode, looking back at it now, is how precisely it predicted the mechanism by which South Park's own controversy worked. The fictional show in It Hits the Fan becomes huge because people are outraged and because people can't stop talking about what they're outraged about. South Park's own scandals operated the same way. The PTC's press releases, the newspaper columns, the school memos, all of it functioned as promotion. There's also a plague in the episode. Using the word repeatedly summons an actual medieval-style plague that kills people. The plague is a joke about consequences, about the gap between the consequences people predict, cultural decay, moral collapse, and the actual consequences of hearing a word. The real consequence of It Hits the Fan was that it got a lot of press coverage. The Parents Television Council issued a statement, and the show continued at exactly the same pace with no regulatory action and no advertiser exodus. It remains, by most records, the single episode of American television with the most uses of that specific word. Not close second, just the first. To understand why the cable distinction mattered so much, it helps to know what was happening to broadcast television at exactly this time. The Janet Jackson wardrobe incident at the 2004 Super Bowl, which we haven't gotten to yet but will, was still 3 years away when It Hits the Fan aired. But the regulatory tension was already building. The FCC had been moving towards stricter enforcement of its indecency rules for years. And broadcast networks were in an environment where a single slip could result in a significant fine. The difference between a $27,500 fine, the cap before 2004, and a $500,000 fine per incident is the difference between an annoyance and a catastrophe for a local affiliate. Cable sat outside all of that, and Parker and Stone understood this clearly. The rules that applied to ABC and NBC and CBS simply did not apply to them in the same way. Comedy Central could air language that would cost a broadcast station enormous amounts of money, with essentially no equivalent consequence. This structural freedom was one of the reasons South Park could exist the way it did. The show was built in a regulatory space where the traditional enforcement mechanisms couldn't reach it. Kenny dying in the episode in a plague-related way, by the way, is among my personal favorite Kenny deaths in the show's history. Not for any deep reason, just because the commitment to having him die in the specific context of the episode's argument. Killed not by random accident, but by the thematic content of the story itself, is a level of consistency I find quietly satisfying. The show never broke its internal logic for convenience. If there's a plague, Kenny gets the plague. If there's a bear suit, Kenny gets the bear suit. There's something very earnest about that, hidden inside a show that aggressively performs the opposite of earnest. Comedy Central re-aired it in syndication without editing it. The word stayed in every time. The episode also did something more subtle that I think is worth mentioning. The fictional TV drama at the center of the plot, cop drama, is treated by the characters in the show as a big, serious cultural moment. People gather around their televisions to watch it. News anchors cover it. It feels like an event. The joke, if you're watching closely, is that the fictional show is doing something slightly edgy that everyone is treating as enormously significant. Meanwhile, the actual show containing this joke is doing something far more extreme and treating it as entirely unremarkable. Parker and Stone were always very good at this kind of layered self-awareness. South Park regularly made jokes about the culture of outrage around South Park while being the thing causing the outrage. It Hits the Fan is probably the clearest example of this. An episode about media coverage of a word, running on a cable channel whose network executives were presumably bracing for media coverage of the episode itself. The recursion is deliberate, and it's funny if you're standing at the right angle to see it. There's also a small and easily missed moment in It Hits the Fan that I've always liked. Mr. Garrison, the boys' teacher, is one of the characters who registers genuine alarm at the word being used on television. He is, of course, a character who has spent multiple seasons saying and doing things of comparable or greater offensiveness on a regular basis. His alarm is entirely unironic within the episode. He genuinely cannot believe someone said that word on TV. This is South Park being extremely specific about the gap between what people find offensive in the abstract and what they're comfortable with in practice. Garrison doesn't register his own behavior as belonging to the same category as the thing he's upset about. That's a very precise observation about human nature. It's doing it through a cartoon character in a bad wig, but the observation is precise. Parker and Stone filed this one alongside the film experience in their understanding of what was actually possible. The FCC was a real force, but only over broadcast. Cable was different. And within cable's different rules, the only real limit was whether the network was willing to pull something. And Comedy Central, by 2001, had learned that South Park's controversies brought in audiences rather than driving them away. What came next, though, was going to be a different kind of fight, not regulatory, personal. South Park's 9th season contains, in my view, 2 of the most consequential episodes the show ever made. They aired within a few weeks of each other in late 2005, They triggered completely different fights, and they changed the show's relationship with two completely different institutions. One of those episodes we'll get to shortly. The other is Trapped in the Closet, which is, on its face, an episode about Scientology, but is also an episode about Tom Cruise, John Travolta, R. Kelly, and the ways in which celebrities use institutional membership for protection. It's also, in a technical sense, about a closet. Here's what happens in the episode. Stan takes a Scientology personality test, mostly because the organization is offering it for free outside a community center. The auditor who processes Stan's results sends them immediately to higher-ups because Stan's scores are extraordinary. Off the charts in a way the auditor has never seen before. Word travels up the chain. The conclusion that comes back down is that Stan is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. The president of Scientology arrives at the Marsh household and tells the family the news. Stan is brought into the church. He goes through a formal auditing session and eventually receives the full cosmological explanation for what Scientology teaches. A story involving an intergalactic ruler named Xenu who, 75 million years ago, brought billions of people to Earth and murdered them near volcanoes, whose spirits now cling to the living and cause psychological suffering. This is presented on screen with detailed animation, while a banner at the bottom reads, in plain text, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." That phrase, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," stayed on screen for an extended period, long enough to make sure everyone watching understood that Parker and Stone were not embellishing or satirizing the theology. They were presenting it as accurately as they could. Stan encounters Tom Cruise in his bedroom. Cruise asks Stan, as the reincarnation of Hubbard, to evaluate his acting. Stan thinks about it honestly and says he's all right, maybe not as good as some other people. He's polite but not enthusiastic. This crushes Cruise, who, in the episode's central extended joke, walks into Stan's closet and will not come out. John Travolta, also a prominent Scientologist in real life, shows up to try to coax Cruise out. He ends up in the closet too. R. Kelly arrives, singing in the style of his then famous Trapped in the Closet song series, and also ends up in the closet. Nicole Kidman appears. Various other characters try and fail. A running gag throughout the episode has reporters delivering news updates along the lines of Tom Cruise still won't come out of the closet, with the phrase played completely straight. The episode ends with Stan trying to deliver new doctrine to the Scientology community, essentially telling them that Hubbard didn't know what he was doing when he wrote it all down, that he was making things up, that the whole thing was a scam. Cruise comes out of the closet furious. He threatens to sue. "Go ahead," Stan shouts, "I dare you." The credits roll under the names John Smith and Jane Smith. Every single person who worked on the episode is listed under one of those two names, not as a joke, as a precaution. Parker and Stone knew enough about Scientology's history of litigation against its critics to be genuinely cautious. The Church of Scientology had a documented history, going back decades, of pursuing legal action against critics, journalists, and former members who spoke publicly against the organization. Books had been suppressed, lawsuits had been filed in multiple countries, journalists had faced harassment campaigns. The organization had a reputation for being extremely aggressive in protecting itself from public criticism through whatever legal and procedural mechanisms it could deploy. Parker and Stone knew this. The decision to anonymize the credits was deliberate and specific. A small, practical acknowledgement that making fun of Scientology carried risks that making fun of other targets didn't. They made the episode anyway. They just made sure the people who worked on it had a layer of protection. The Xenu story itself deserves a moment here, not as a judgment of any belief, but as a detail about how the episode worked. The cosmological mythology of Scientology, the Xenu narrative, the Thatans, the galactic history, is a real part of the religion's doctrine. and it is also material that the Church of Scientology has at various times actively tried to keep from public circulation. Higher-level doctrinal materials were treated as confidential. The reasoning was that the content could be misunderstood if presented out of context. Trapped in the closet presented it in context, or rather in the absence of context. Just the story, labeled clearly as what Scientologists actually believe. Parker and Stone's argument was not that the theology was wrong. It was that the secrecy around it was curious, and that a religion requiring members to advance through paid levels before accessing certain doctrines was structurally different from most religious traditions that make their core texts publicly available. The "This is what Scientologists actually believe" banner running at the bottom of the screen during the Xenu sequence was one of the episode's most commented on elements. It was factually accurate. The content shown was documented Scientology doctrine. The presentational choice, the flat informational banner, as though this were a documentary clarification rather than a joke, was itself the joke. The deadpan underscored the content rather than explaining it. Now, the episode was controversial on its own terms. But the actual controversy, the one that changed things, happened when the episode was scheduled for a rerun. The episode had aired once without obvious incident. A rerun was scheduled for March 2006. Around the same time, it became clear through entertainment press reporting that Tom Cruise had expressed unhappiness about the episode. More specifically, there were reports, never fully confirmed, never fully denied, that Cruise had told Paramount Pictures, which owned the rights to the upcoming mission, Impossible 3, that he would not promote the film if Comedy Central reran the episode. Paramount and Viacom, Comedy Central's parent company at that point, were connected. The pressure, if it existed, had a path. The rerun was quietly canceled. It was replaced with another episode without announcement. Parker and Stone found out through the trade press, not through a phone call, not through a conversation. They read it in the entertainment news like everyone else. Their response was a written statement they released publicly. The relevant portion said something to the effect of, if they could not make fun of Scientology, they would have to stop making fun of everyone, which would mean stopping making the show. The statement was brief and specific. They were not bluffing. The Paramount connection deserves a bit more explanation because it illustrates how corporate structures can create unexpected leverage over creative content. Paramount Pictures, which owns the distribution rights to Mission, Impossible Films, and Viacom, which owned Comedy Central, were at the time both subsidiaries of the same parent company. This meant that a threat by a star not to promote a Paramount film could, in theory, be communicated upward through the corporate structure and exert pressure downward on a completely different part of the company, specifically the cable channel that aired his critics. Whether this is exactly how it worked, nobody has confirmed on the record, but the circumstantial evidence was striking enough that entertainment industry observers wrote about the apparent connection at the time. A rerun gets canceled. A star had expressed unhappiness. A parent company had reasons to keep the star cooperative. No one needed to make an explicit phone call for the pressure to exist. This kind of corporate pressure is invisible in a way that regulatory pressure and organized advocacy pressure are not. A PTC campaign generates press releases. An FCC inquiry generates paperwork. But a conversation somewhere in a corporate hierarchy, one that may never be documented, that all parties have incentive to deny, can move things around in ways that look from the outside like editorial decisions rather than external influence. Parker and Stone seem to have understood this intuitively. Their statement was an attempt to make the situation visible, to say explicitly what appeared to be happening so that the invisible mechanism had to either be confirmed or denied. It forced Comedy Central into a position where whatever they decided would be legible. Either run the episode and the star's influence had failed, or don't run it and confirm that it had worked. Comedy Central did eventually rerun the episode. It has aired many times since. Tom Cruise did not sue. The mission, impossible. 3 situation resolved itself, but the sequence of events had revealed something about how corporate relationships could be used as leverage against creative content, and Parker and Stone had been made to feel, however briefly, the difference between having a platform and controlling one. Isaac Hayes was the voice of Chef, the school chef at South Park Elementary. He had been there since the first episode in 1997. Chef was a warm, good-natured character who dispensed improbable romantic advice, cooked food, sang soul songs, and was generally the adults-in-the-room presence the show needed as a counterweight to all the chaos. Hayes, who was a real person with a real recording career before South Park, brought genuine warmth and actual musicianship to the role. Some of Chef's songs are genuinely good songs. Hayes was also a practicing Scientologist. After Trapped in the Closet aired, Hayes remained quiet. He didn't complain publicly, he didn't issue a statement, he came back for the next season. Then, in March of 2006, just as the rerun situation with Cruise was becoming a story, Hayes issued a statement through his publicist. He was leaving South Park, he said, because the show had crossed a line. Specifically, he named intolerance of religious beliefs as his reason. The show was fine mocking everything else, he acknowledged, but faith was something he couldn't be part of satirizing. Parker and Stone responded publicly with genuine frustration. They pointed out, accurately, that South Park had been mocking Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Hinduism, and essentially every other major religion for 9 years. Hayes had not objected to any of it. The show had spent an entire episode in which Jesus and Satan had a boxing match. It had a recurring character called Damien, the son of the devil. It had mocked the Pope. Hayes had happily voiced Chef through all of that. This was the episode that finally crossed the line for him. Parker and Stone found this unconvincing. The implication they drew publicly was that Hayes had been fine with the show attacking other people's beliefs for years, and drew the line only when his own beliefs were the subject. But here's the part of the story that complicates everything, and that didn't fully come out until later. In January of 2006, Isaac Hayes suffered a stroke. His stroke happened before his statement was released. His son, Isaac Hayes III, said in subsequent years that Hayes had been incapacitated by the stroke when the statement was issued, and that someone else, either a representative or someone in his life connected to Scientology, had issued the statement on his behalf, that Hayes himself may never have made the decision. If that's true, the whole narrative shifts. A man who had been part of South Park's cast for 9 years, who may well have been entirely comfortable continuing, was pulled from the show by people acting without his informed consent while he was in a hospital recovering from a brain injury. Hayes died in August of 2008 from complications of his stroke. He never publicly contradicted the statement issued in his name. His son's account came later and has been reported on but never formally resolved. We don't know for certain what Isaac Hayes himself actually wanted to do about South Park in those months. It's worth sitting with this for a moment because it's genuinely sad in a way that the public narrative around the controversy doesn't always leave room for. Hayes had a career that preceded South Park by decades. He was a Grammy award-winning recording artist. He had written and produced music for other artists, scored films, performed internationally. Shaft is an Isaac Hayes composition and production, which is not a small thing. He was not a voice actor who happened to get famous through a cartoon. He was an established, respected artist who took a voice role in a cartoon that happened to become one of the most culturally significant shows of its era. The relationship he had with Parker and Stone, by most accounts, was genuinely warm for the 9 years it lasted. He recorded for them week after week. He brought something to Chef that another voice couldn't easily replicate. A musicality, a warmth, a sense of genuine affection for the children the character was looking after. And then the end of that relationship happened in circumstances that were murky at best and potentially deeply unfair at worst. Whatever the truth of the stroke and the statement, Hayes' son has consistently maintained that his father was not the one who decided to leave, that he was a man who had lost the ability to fully advocate for himself in a key moment, and that someone acted on his behalf in a way that may not have reflected his wishes. We don't know. What we do know is that the man who voiced Chef for 9 years died 2 years after his departure, and that the show he was part of is still running more than 15 years after his death, and that the character he gave his voice to has been dead within the show's world for almost as long. What we do know is that Chef was still in the show's world after Hayes' departure, and Parker and Stone had to do something about it. What they did was this. They built an episode around it, and that episode is worth its own section. Parker and Stone had a practical problem. Their most beloved recurring character was played by an actor who was no longer available to record new dialogue. Whatever they thought about the circumstances of his departure, and they had thoughts about it, the show still had to keep moving. The first episode of season 10 was going to have to address Chef's absence somehow. The question was how. They could have recast him quietly. Other shows have done this. A new voice slips in, the character continues. Most viewers adjust without much comment. They chose not to do that. They could have simply retired the character, moved Chef off screen, given him a new job somewhere, let him fade away without ceremony. They chose not to do that either. What they did was build an episode around it. And the episode they built is one of the stranger and more emotionally complicated things the show ever produced. Hayes had voiced Chef for 9 years. Over those 9 years, he had recorded thousands of lines of dialogue. Parker and Stone went through the archive. They pulled sentences, phrases, fragments of lines, and they spliced them together to create new dialogue that Hayes had technically never spoken. Words and syllables from one context stitched to words and syllables from another, creating sentences that existed in no original recording but sounded more or less like Chef saying them. The result was Chef returning to South Park after a long absence, behaving strangely. He is warm but off. Something isn't right. The boys notice. It comes out that Chef has been recruited by an organization called the Super Adventure Club, which is coded very, very clearly as Scientology. Down to its pseudoscientific initiation levels, its practice of getting members to gradually reveal secrets, and its use of litigation against critics. The Super Adventure Club has gotten into Chef's head, the children realize. Their friend isn't really there anymore. What's speaking through him has the surface of Chef, but not the substance. The episode then kills Chef in detail. He falls off a cliff, is impaled, is set on fire, is torn apart by a mountain lion and a bear, and is resurrected at the end as a grotesque villain called Darth Chef, now fully in the service of the Super Adventure Club. Parker and Stone issued a statement alongside the episode. They said they'd always have love for Chef as a character, who had been a beloved part of the show since the beginning. They had no such love, the statement continued, for the organization they believed had taken Hayes away from them. They were keeping the two things, in Okatsu, the character and the circumstances of the character's departure, clearly distinct. Chef was honored. What happened to Chef was not. The splicing technique itself is worth a moment of thought. Building dialogue from fragments of existing recordings, taking a word from one episode, a phrase from another, stitching them together into sentences that were never spoken, is something that has become more technically sophisticated in the decades since, but in 2006 it was unusual and notable. The result in The Return of Chef is slightly uncanny. Hayes' voice is recognizably Hayes, but the rhythm is off in small ways. The emotional register shifts unexpectedly between phrases. It sounds like Chef, but it sounds like Chef filtered through something strange, which is of course exactly what the episode was going for. The choice to use the spliced audio rather than simply recasting the role was itself a statement. Parker and Stone could have found another voice actor to take over Chef. They chose not to. They chose to use Hayes' actual voice, build from what already existed, and then kill the character in a way that acknowledged the wrongness of how it had happened. It was a kind of documentary fidelity. This is what happened, this is what it sounded like, this is how it ended. What I find myself sitting with when I think about this episode is how much emotion is actually in it. The episode is aggressive. The spliced dialogue is deliberately disorienting. The death is deliberately graphic. The villain resurrection is deliberately bleak. But underneath the aggression is something that reads, if you're paying attention, like genuine grief. These were people who had worked with Isaac Hayes for almost a decade, who had built something with him season after season, episode after episode, and then he was gone in circumstances that Parker and Stone found inexplicable, and they felt dishonest. The boys in the episode are genuinely devastated. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny's reaction to Chef's death is played, unusual for South Park, with real weight. Kyle delivers a eulogy at the end of the episode that is one of the more sincere moments in the show's history. He says that they shouldn't be mad at Chef for what happened, that they should be mad at the people who manipulated him, that they should remember him not for how things ended, but for how he was. That distinction between the person and the institution felt personal. It felt like Parker and Stone working something out on screen. Kyle's eulogy is worth spending a moment with because it's one of those pieces of dialogue that doesn't get quoted much, but that sticks with you. He says roughly that Chef was their friend and they loved him, and that no matter how he changed at the end, they shouldn't let that define how they remembered him. He says the memories they had of him were real and good, and nobody could take those away, even if whatever came back to them in his final weeks wasn't really him. It's a child delivering a piece of wisdom that adults sometimes take decades to articulate. The show didn't announce it as being about anything other than Chef, but it was also clearly about Isaac Hayes. Parker and Stone never said that directly. They didn't need to. Chef is permanently dead within the South Park universe. He has appeared as a ghost or in flashback since, occasionally, but he has never returned as a living member of the community. A character who was present in the first episode in 1997 is gone. The cooking smells from the school cafeteria don't come up much anymore. Isaac Hayes III has continued to speak publicly about his father's legacy over the years. In 2016, on the 20th anniversary of the show, he said he wanted people to remember his father as a whole person, his music career, his acting, his activism. Rather than just for the South Park departure, he reiterated the suggestion that his father had not been the one to make the decision to leave. Parker and Stone have not responded to that account publicly. Whether they believe it, whether it changed how they felt about things, isn't something they've said. What remains is the episode and the character's absence, and the 9 years of recordings from which 2 minutes of spliced dialogue were assembled. And somewhere in a digital archive, thousands of Isaac Hayes' recordings of Chef lines still sitting there. Lines from a character who no longer exists in the story, voiced by a man who no longer exists in the world. That image, for some reason, stays with me. A few months before the Trapped in the Closet episode aired, South Park closed its 9th season with an episode that generated a completely separate controversy from a completely separate group of people. The episode was called Bloody Mary, and the organization it put on a collision course with the show was the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. December 2005. The episode's main plot involves Randy Marsh, Stan's father, a character who over the seasons becomes increasingly central to the show's comedy, being caught drunk driving and enrolling in Alcoholics Anonymous. Randy, through AA, convinces himself he is a helpless victim of disease who has no agency in his drinking. The boys find this pathetic. There's a running argument throughout the episode about whether alcoholism is a disease or a choice, and the show comes down somewhere unusual, not in favor of either the clinical or the moralistic position, but in favor of Randy actually taking responsibility for his own behavior. Alongside this main plot runs a secondary story. A statue of the Virgin Mary in the town square appears to be bleeding. People start treating it as a miracle. Pilgrims arrive. The Pope himself, Pope Benedict XVI, referred to in the episode as Benedict XVI, visits to investigate. He examines the statue and discovers that it is not, as believed, bleeding from a wound. The statue is, he determines, menstruating. This, the Pope concludes, is not a miracle, since women menstruate all the time. He leaves. The episode ends with Randy understanding that his drinking is under his control, not beyond it. The statue aspect is resolved and largely dropped. Bill Donahue was the president of the Catholic League. He had been watching South Park for years and had issued statements about various episodes, but Bloody Mary genuinely galvanized him. His response was immediate and sustained. He put out a press release calling the episode disgraceful, arguing that it depicted the Virgin Mary in a way that was explicitly designed to demean and humiliate Catholic belief, and demanding that Viacom, Comedy Central's parent company, take action. His campaign went in several directions simultaneously. He reached out to the League's members and asked them to file complaints with Viacom directly. He held press conferences, he gave interviews, he organized a letter-writing campaign targeting Comedy Central advertisers. He maintained the pressure over weeks and months in a way that most single-episode controversies don't sustain. Viacom initially pulled the episode from its scheduled rerun. The episode had aired once, in December 2005, and then the January rerun did not happen. This was taken by the Catholic League as a partial victory, though they were pushing for the episode to be permanently removed from circulation entirely. What made the situation unusual was what happened in New Zealand. South Park aired in New Zealand on a network called C4. The Bloody Mary episode aired there in January 2006. The Broadcasting Standards Authority of New Zealand, a regulatory body that actually has formal power over broadcast content, received complaints about the episode. They processed those complaints, and in a ruling issued later in 2006, they upheld some of them. The BSA found that the episode had breached New Zealand broadcasting standards on good taste and decency. It was a formal finding. C4 was asked to ensure the episode did not air again in New Zealand, and it didn't. This made Bloody Mary the first South Park episode to be formally found in violation of broadcasting standards by a regulatory body in an English-speaking country. In New Zealand, at least, it was gone. Back in the United States, the situation resolved differently. Comedy Central never permanently pulled the episode. After the initial canceled rerun, the episode did come back to the rotation. It has aired many times since. The Catholic League's campaign, in which continued in various forms for years, did not ultimately result in the episode's removal from American television. Parker and Stone's position throughout was essentially the same one they had held since the beginning of the show. They treated all religions with the same kind of irreverence. Christianity was not exempt from the same treatment they gave Islam or Judaism or Scientology or Buddhism. To treat it differently, to make it off limits while everything else remained fair game, would be a kind of special status they had no interest in granting. This position is in principle a defensible one. Consistency is a reasonable standard for satire, and South Park had demonstrated it consistently enough over the years that the argument wasn't hollow. The show had done extended episodes mocking Christian doctrine, Jewish tradition, Islamic belief, Mormon theology, and every other major faith with roughly equal irreverence. But there's a counter-argument that some critics made about Bloody Mary specifically, which is worth sitting with. The episode's treatment of the Virgin Mary is not simply irreverent. It's designed to be maximally gross about a figure who, for millions of Catholics, represents something genuinely sacred. The specific choice of what the statue was doing and the specific way the Pope responded to it was not just making a joke about religion, it was making a joke designed to be as viscerally offensive as possible to people who held the depicted figure in sincere reverence. Whether that matters legally or ethically is a different question from whether it's true. Parker and Stone were within their creative rights. The Catholic League's campaign was legally ineffective, and yet the episode exists in a different register from, say, Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, where the warmth of the treatment was part of the point. Bloody Mary wasn't trying to be warm about anything. It was trying to be as crude as it could manage about something a lot of people cared about deeply. I don't think that makes it wrong. I think it's just a more complicated version of the consistency argument. Being equally willing to offend everyone is a position. Being equally willing to be maximally offensive to everyone is a slightly different position, and it generates a slightly different kind of response. The New Zealand ruling against the episode, the formal finding that it breached broadcasting standards, is interesting precisely because it establishes that there are regulatory frameworks in which the Catholic League's argument actually has legal weight. The New Zealand BSA didn't make a call about Parker and Stone's rights as creators. It made a call about what the Broadcasting Standards Act of New Zealand required. Those are different conversations, and the fact that they reach different conclusions tells you something about how culturally specific our frameworks for handling offensive content actually are. Donahue continued to issue statements about South Park episodes for years after Bloody Mary. He and the Catholic League remained one of the show's most consistent critics, but the episode stayed on the air. The cultural power of a determined advocacy group operating in the cable television environment of 2005 and 2006 with no regulatory mechanism to invoke turned out to be real but limited. What the Bloody Mary situation demonstrated, and what would keep demonstrating itself throughout the show's history, was that sustained pressure from an organized group could generate press coverage, could occasionally delay a rerun, could sometimes prompt cautious responses from a network. What it couldn't do in most cases was actually remove content from a cable channel that had decided the content was worth keeping. There's something oddly clarifying about that. The Catholic League spent years and significant resources trying to get one 22-minute episode pulled from a cable channel, and the cable channel never actually did it. Whether that's the right outcome is a separate question. As a description of how the power dynamics actually worked, it's pretty honest. The Steve Irwin situation, which happened a year later, is worth a quick mention here since it lives in the same neighborhood of complaints about how the show handles real people and sensitive circumstances. Steve Irwin, the Australian naturalist and television personality widely known as the Crocodile Hunter, died on September 4th, 2006 from a stingray injury while diving at the Great Barrier Reef. He was 44. His death was a genuine shock. He was beloved, particularly in Australia, in a way that was less about celebrity than about genuine affection. Parker and Stone had filmed a Halloween episode, Hell on Earth 2006, Season 10, that included a brief scene where a party guest arrives dressed as Steve Irwin, with a stingray attached to his chest where the barb would be. The episode was already in production or completed when Irwin died. It aired on October 25, 2006, about 7 weeks after his death. Australian media and a portion of South Park's general audience found the scene deeply uncomfortable. There were calls for the episode to be pulled, particularly from Australian networks. In some markets, the episode was indeed not aired. Parker and Stone's position was that it was already finished before he died, which is true, and that they had not anticipated the timing, which is also presumably true. It wasn't the same scale as the Catholic League campaign. It didn't produce the same sustained pressure, but it was a reminder that South Park's production speed, the thing that allowed them to comment on current events faster than any other show, occasionally created exactly the opposite problem. Content that had been made in one context landing in a completely different one. In September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a set of editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The decision to do this was deliberate, The paper's editors were making a point about self-censorship in European media and whether Islam was being given a special immunity from the kind of criticism and satire applied to other subjects. The response was global in a way that was genuinely shocking in scale. Protests spread across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Embassies were attacked, there were deaths, governments became involved, the cartoonists required security. European media spent months debating whether to reprint the images in solidarity or decline in the interest of safety. Most American media chose not to reprint them. The episode established in a very visible and very violent way what the practical consequences of depicting Muhammad could look like. The self-censorship that followed the Jyllands-Posten situation was real and documented. Publications that would have printed almost anything declined to reprint the cartoons. Networks that routinely covered international news treated the images as too sensitive to show. The practical effect of the threat of violence on media behavior was measurable, and it wasn't subtle. Editors and producers across Western media were making explicit decisions to limit their own coverage based on what a violent response might look like. Parker and Stone had been watching something similar operate on a smaller scale within their own experience since Trapped in the Closet. They had felt, however briefly, what it was like to have a corporate structure respond to external pressure in ways that affected their creative output. The Jyllands-Posten situation was that phenomenon at global scale, and it made the argument they wanted to make feel urgent. Parker and Stone were watching all of this, and in April of 2006, they aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The premise of Cartoon Wars is elegant in a specific South Park way. Family Guy by Althemi, the actual Fox animated series, has announced that an upcoming episode will show the Prophet Muhammad in a cutaway gag. The country panics. People are terrified of what will happen if the episode airs. The government tries to intervene. Cartman, who hates Family Guy on principle and has been trying to get it canceled for personal reasons entirely unrelated to Muhammad, sees an opportunity and starts organizing a campaign to have the episode pulled. Kyle, who believes in free speech, tries to stop him. The two-part structure allows the episode to do something clever. It can make its argument about censorship while also holding the Muslim community's concerns in the frame. The characters in Cartoon Wars debate whether it's worth airing the image if real people could be hurt as a result. The show doesn't dismiss that concern, it takes it seriously. The argument Kyle makes is not, this doesn't matter. It's, giving in to threats is the more dangerous precedent. The climax of Cartoon Wars Part 2 was supposed to show the Prophet Muhammad on screen, actually depicted, actually visible. This was the point Parker and Stone were building toward. The argument lived out as a piece of television. Comedy Central replaced the image with a black screen and a text card. The text card explained that they had chosen not to air the depiction of Muhammad out of concern for the safety of their employees and others. They did this without telling Parker and Stone in advance. Parker and Stone found out when the episode aired. Their response, issued afterward, was measured but clear. They said Comedy Central's decision had, in their view, undermined the episode's entire argument. The show had made a two-part case for not censoring Muhammad out of fear, and then the network had censored Muhammad out of fear in real time during the broadcast of the episode making that case. The irony was structural. It was the exact thing the episode was arguing against, performed by the entity airing the episode while the episode played. To be fair to Comedy Central, they were operating in the actual world rather than the fictional one. The Jyllands-Posten situation was not abstract. People had died. The conversation about what the consequences of depiction might be was a real conversation. Their caution, whatever you think of it, was not irrational. But it did create a paradox that Parker and Stone never quite let go of. The show that argued most consistently against the principle of making any subject off limits had, in this case, had the subject made off limits by its own network, in real time, during the argument. The Family Guy element of Cartoon Wars is worth a little more attention than it usually gets. Parker and Stone used the episode to make a sustained critical argument about Family Guy's approach to comedy. Specifically, that Family Guy's cutaway gags were random, disconnected from any larger purpose, and that the show was willing to be offensive without the offense meaning anything. Cartman's hatred of Family Guy in the episode is explicitly framed around this critique. It's not just that the show is crude, it's that it's crude without a point. Seth MacFarlane and his team were publicly unamused. The critique was specific enough to be pointed, and came during a period when Family Guy was one of the most popular shows on television. Being told by South Park that your show made jokes without earning them is a particular kind of insult from a particular source. What's interesting is that Parker and Stone were making this critique in an episode that was itself about Muhammad. The implicit argument was, we're willing to make this point because the point matters to us. We're not doing this randomly as a cutaway. We're building a two-part episode around a specific argument. That's the difference between South Park and what they were criticizing in Family Guy. Whether you agree with their self-assessment or not, the positioning was deliberate. Cartoon Wars also established something that 200 and 201 would later complete: a clear public record of where Parker and Stone stood on the question of what could and couldn't be depicted. They had made the case twice by the time 2010 arrived. They had been censored by their own network twice. The third attempt, the 200th episode two-parter, would be the most ambitious and the most consequential. Cartoon Wars also did something less obvious that gets overlooked. It parodied Family Guy extensively and critically, arguing that Family Guy's humor was random, disconnected, unprincipled, that it made jokes without meaning anything by them. This was a real critique of a rival show, embedded inside an episode about free speech. Seth MacFarlane, who created Family Guy, was not entirely amused. It added a layer of television industry interpersonal friction to what was already a complicated episode. What Cartoon Wars established more than anything was the terrain for what was coming. Parker and Stone had now made their position on Muhammad explicit. They thought all subjects should be treated equally. They thought the cultural exemption that had developed around images of Muhammad, while understandable in context, was intellectually inconsistent, and Comedy Central had demonstrated that there was, in practice, a line that even they would not cross. That line would be tested again, more seriously, with consequences that would extend far past the episode itself. It's worth pausing for a moment on what the Cartoon Wars experience actually cost. The episode made its argument. It got censored mid-argument, and then nothing. The show continued. Comedy Central continued. No regulatory action, no organized protest from free speech groups, no boycott from the audience that had been told it couldn't see the image it had been promised. The censorship happened, Parker and Stone objected, and life moved on. This is the thing about censorship victories. They often feel from the outside like non-events. The episode aired with a black screen. Viewers were briefly confused. Fewer people probably noticed than Parker and Stone would have hoped. The incident generated press coverage, articles about what Comedy Central had done, interviews where Parker and Stone expressed frustration. But there was no mechanism to reverse it. The censored version was the version that existed in the world, and the world accepted it and moved on. Parker and Stone had been through enough of these moments to understand that the immediate outcome of a censorship decision is rarely the full story. What matters is what it accumulates into. Cartoon Wars was one data point in an argument that was still being assembled. 200 and 201 4 years later. I would be the next. That line would be tested again. More seriously, with consequences that would extend far past the episode itself. 4 years passed between Cartoon Wars and the next Muhammad episode. In that time, South Park continued doing what it always did. Moving fast, hitting everything, collecting controversies, and setting them down and moving on to the next one. The show did Imagination Land, which was a 3-part trilogy, ambitious enough that it was later recut as a film. It did Make Love, Not Warcraft, which filmed extensively inside the actual World of Warcraft engine. It did things with Randy Marsh that elevated him from a recurring secondary character to something approaching the show's secret main character. And then, in April of 2010, it was the 200th episode. Parker and Stone's idea for the 200th episode was ambitious in a specific way. They would take every major recurring character and running controversy from the show's history and put them all in one story. Every celebrity the show had ever mocked would return. Every past grudge would be revived. Every fight the show had been in would come back for one more round. Tom Cruise leads the returning celebrities. He has organized all of them. Mel Gibson, Kanye West, Barbra Streisand, and dozens more, into a class action lawsuit against South Park. The town of South Park will be destroyed unless the town can produce one specific thing, the Prophet Muhammad. The logic of this is smart in a particular way. Muhammad in the episode is not depicted as holy or protected or special because of religious doctrine. He's depicted as having a practical power. Nobody can make fun of him. The celebrities want that. They want to be immune to mockery the way Muhammad is. This reframes the Muhammad situation as being about power and double standards rather than faith. In 200, Muhammad is present but hidden. He's heard through a door or concealed inside a bear costume. His presence is felt but not shown. And the episode plays with this deliberately. The bear costume is a winking reference to the Cartoon Wars situation years earlier, when Muhammad had been hidden and then censored. Parker and Stone were building toward something. Between the airing of 200 on April 14, 2010, and the airing of 201 the following week, an organization called Revolution Muslim published something on their website. Revolution Muslim was a small radical Islamic organization based in New York City. Their post referenced the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who was murdered in November 2004 by a man who took issue with a short film Van Gogh had made about the treatment of women in Islam. Van Gogh was shot and stabbed while cycling to work in Amsterdam. A note was left on his body. The post did not say, "We will kill you." The post said that Parker and Stone would probably wind up like Theo van Gogh if they continued. The author wrote that this was a warning, not a threat. The distinction, given the context of what they were invoking, was not a distinction most people found reassuring. The NYPD increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters in New York City. Law enforcement acknowledged publicly that Revolution Muslim itself was not known to have committed actual violence, but that the concern was whether the post could inspire someone who might. That is a real and specific distinction. The threat from the post itself versus the threat the post might amplify. 201 aired April 21, 2010. But the version that aired was not the version Parker and Stone had submitted. The episode, as delivered to the network, concluded with a closing speech by Kyle, a monologue about fear, about the decision to give any group veto power over what can be discussed, about what that precedent means for speech broadly. It was the moral of the episode stated directly. Comedy Central had inserted audio bleeps over every mention of Muhammad's name throughout the episode. Images of Muhammad, or what the viewer was meant to understand as Muhammad, were covered with large, black, censored bars. And the closing speech by Kyle had been bleeped almost in its entirety. Parker and Stone released a statement immediately after the episode aired. They clarified that the bleeped images and the name censorship were their own idea, as a commentary on the censorship situation itself. The bleeped-out closing speech, however, was not their idea. Comedy Central had done that without their knowledge or consent. A spokesperson for Comedy Central confirmed this in a line that has been quoted many times since. He said, "I can confirm it was Comedy Central that inserted the bleeps and not South Park." He declined to elaborate on the reasoning. Jon Stewart, on The Daily Show the following day, spent 10 minutes on the situation. He was disgusted by Revolution Muslim's post, specific about that disgust, and simultaneously critical of Comedy Central's decision to alter the episode. He acknowledged that Comedy Central was likely trying to protect their employees from possible harm and that this was understandable. He made the point that the irony of censoring an episode whose argument was against censorship was not lost on him. Bill Maher said the threats demonstrated precisely why the First Amendment existed, and that a culture that made death threats against cartoonists was not equivalent to one that didn't. Then Comedy Central made a further decision. 201 would not be rerun. It would be removed from the official South Park streaming archive. It would not be available on the network's own site. The episode would simply not be accessible through official channels. And then 200 went with it. And then Super Best Friends, the season 5 episode from 2001, years before any of this controversy existed, where Muhammad had appeared as part of a superhero team without any censorship at all, was pulled too, and Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2 were removed as well. 5 episodes, every single one of them connecting to the question of whether Muhammad could be depicted. The situation took on an additional and genuinely strange dimension a few weeks later, in May of 2010. A car bomb was found in Times Square in New York City. The device failed to detonate and was discovered before anyone was hurt. A suspect was arrested and linked to connections in Pakistan. In the immediate aftermath, some law enforcement and political figures suggested that the South Park controversy, specifically the Revolution Muslim post, might have been related to the attack as a motive or inspiration. The connection turned out to be essentially non-existent. The investigation found that the Times Square attempt had been planned months before the 200/201 episodes aired, and the perpetrator had no documented connection to Revolution Muslim. U.S. Congressman Peter King said publicly it was one possibility out of 100. Revolution Muslim's only spokesperson denied any involvement. The connection didn't hold up, but for a brief and disorienting few weeks, the events had been linked in public discussion. A failed car bomb in Times Square, a censored cartoon episode, a radical organization's website post, and the implication that a South Park episode had somehow contributed to a real-world attack attempt was out there in the news cycle before it was disproved. Parker and Stone did not comment on this publicly in any substantial way. As of 2026, all 5 episodes remain unavailable on any official U.S. platform. They cannot be streamed on Paramount Plus, where South Park now lives. They cannot be purchased digitally. They are not available for download. When South Park, the complete series, has been released, these episodes have been absent. The show's own studio website, which for years offered free streaming of most episodes, does not have them. The audio commentary for 200 and 201 still exists on the DVD releases of those seasons. In the commentary, Parker and Stone never once say Muhammad. They refer to the character as the prophet of the Muslim faith. In the commentary for 201, midway through, Stone says something about what they had been trying to do, and then a large audio beep obscures the commentary. And then Stone says, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." The beep is in the commentary of the DVD of their own show. The censorship followed them even into the behind-the-scenes material. Uncensored versions of both 200 and 201 exist online. They've been there for years. This is one of those situations where the practical effect of the censorship is essentially zero in terms of anyone being prevented from seeing the material, and where the actual effect is that the censorship itself became the most widely discussed part of the story. Parker and Stone's argument about the absurdity of giving any subject veto power over what could be depicted has in a way been made continuously for 15 years by the existence of 5 episodes that cannot be found on the streaming service their show calls home. There's a version of this story where you read Comedy Central's decisions charitably. They were accompanied with employees and offices and a genuine responsibility for the safety of real people. The NYPD had increased security at their building. That is not nothing. And the decision they made was not, "We will change the episode because we're embarrassed by it." It was, "We will change the episode because someone has invoked the name of a murdered filmmaker in connection with the people who made it." The case of Theo van Gogh, which Revolution Muslim had invoked, was real and specific. Van Gogh had been shot and stabbed on a morning cycle ride through Amsterdam in November 2004 by a man acting on his conviction that the film Van Gogh had made about the treatment of women in Islam deserved a violent response. Van Gogh was not a public figure in the same way that an American celebrity would be. He was a filmmaker and commentator who had been critical of Islamic fundamentalism. He was killed in broad daylight on a public street. The note left on his body addressed his collaborator, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, directly. It was a targeted political killing over the content of a creative work. The post on Revolution Muslim's website had cited this case by name. Comedy Central was not responding to an abstract rhetorical threat. They were responding to a reference to a specific murder attached to a warning directed at the specific people who had made their show. And there's the other version of the story, the one Parker and Stone lived in, where the censorship validated the threat, established that violence or the threat of violence could reach into a television studio and alter a finished piece of work, and sent a signal about what could and could not be discussed that has never been walked back. Both versions are simultaneously true. That's what makes this the most complicated chapter in the show's history. There's no clean resolution. There's no right answer. There are two real things happening at the same time. And they pull in opposite directions, and they have been pulling in opposite directions for 16 years. South Park turned this into material almost immediately. 201, the censored version, is itself a kind of statement. The beeps, the bars, the missing speech. Parker and Stone have never pretended to be at peace with how it happened, but they've also never made a concerted public campaign to reverse it. The episodes stay unavailable, the conversation stays unresolved, and the show kept going. October 2019. South Park had been on the air for 22 years. Over those 22 years, the Chinese entertainment market had grown into something that Hollywood couldn't reasonably ignore. Chinese box office had become essential math for major films. Studios were making production decisions based on whether content would be acceptable to Chinese distributors and regulators. Characters who might be Chinese villains were rewritten. Storylines that touched on politically sensitive subjects were softened or removed. Entire scenes were cut from films before they could receive Chinese distribution approval. This was a widely acknowledged reality in the entertainment industry by 2019. It was documented, discussed, written about extensively. The self-censorship was real, and the financial incentive behind it was real. And for the most part, Hollywood had decided, collectively and largely quietly, that the financial math made it worth it. Parker and Stone had been watching this for years. The season 23 episode, Banned in China, was their response. The episode runs two parallel plots. In the first, Randy Marsh, now running Tegrity Farms, his cannabis operation, which had become the show's dominant ongoing storyline by this point, tries to expand his marijuana business into China. He arrives, attempts to do business, and keeps accidentally getting himself and others thrown into labor camps. The camps are depicted exactly as you'd imagine a South Park labor camp to be: brutal, visually specific, and played for dark comedy that doesn't pretend the underlying thing is funny. In one scene, Randy shares a cell with Winnie the Pooh. This is the kind of thing that needs a sentence of context. In the years before Banned in China, memes comparing Winnie the Pooh's character design to images of Xi Jinping had spread widely online. The comparison was visual and informal. People noticed a resemblance, made jokes about it. The Chinese government responded by banning Winnie the Pooh content on Chinese platforms. Certain images were removed, references were scrubbed. A 2018 Disney film was denied Chinese distribution in part, it was widely reported, because of the Pooh character's presence. The bear had become, in a specific and involuntary way, a symbol of censorship in China. Parker and Stone put him in a gulag. The second plot in Banned in China involves the boys forming a band that gets discovered by Hollywood, which then attempts to reshape them for Chinese commercial appeal. Everything that makes them interesting, specific, and real has to go. The Chinese market requires blandness, requires the absence of anything that might cause difficulty. The boys watch their music become something unrecognizable. It's a pretty direct metaphor. The episode aired October 2nd, 2019. China's response was not a formal complaint. It was not a diplomatic note. It was total removal. Within hours, South Park began disappearing from the Chinese internet. Episodes on Chinese streaming platforms were taken down. The show's name became unsearchable on Weibo, Baidu, and other major platforms. Fan communities that had existed for years went dark. References to the show in Chinese social media were removed. The search term South Park returned nothing. In a few days, South Park had been effectively erased from the Chinese internet. 22 years of episodes, the entire archive, community spaces, critical discussion, gone. As complete a deletion as the infrastructure allowed. Parker and Stone issued a statement. It was 4 sentences. It has been quoted so many times since that it's become a kind of landmark of what a specific kind of creative courage sounds like when it's stated simply. They said they were proud of Banned in China and thanked China for the attention. They said they had learned a lot from the NBA, which had been embroiled in its own China controversy in the same week, involving a tweet from a Houston Rockets executive expressing support for Hong Kong protesters. They said, like the NBA, they welcomed China and its money into their country and would not say anything about how China treats its people. But unlike the NBA, they said they didn't care about losing Chinese money. They ended by saying they were officially in support of Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Uyghurs, and that they would see everyone in hell. The statement is about 150 words long and contains more direct political positions than most entertainment companies take in a decade of public relations work. The contrast with the NBA situation in the same week was stark. The NBA had immediately moved to contain the damage, apologize, clarify, distance. Their business relationship with China was enormous. Broadcast deals, merchandise, preseason games played in Chinese stadiums. They had a great deal to lose, and they managed the situation accordingly. South Park, by contrast, was not relying on Chinese revenue. The show doesn't have a version of itself that requires Chinese distribution. Their business is built on Comedy Central, on streaming, on merchandise sold in Western markets. China banning them was, in practical financial terms, close to irrelevant. What makes the Banned in China response distinct from most Hollywood behavior in this period is not just the courage of the statement. It's the structural reality that made the courage affordable. Parker and Stone had spent 22 years building a show with a specific production model, a specific distribution relationship, and a specific creative ownership structure that didn't require permission from outside their immediate circle. They owned the show through their own production company. They delivered it directly to Comedy Central. There was no Chinese co-production deal, no Chinese distribution partner, no Chinese streaming agreement. The entire financial structure of what they had built was insulated from the pressure that was silencing other people. That insulation wasn't accidental. Parker and Stone have talked in various interviews about deliberate decisions they made over the years, about what deals to take and what to decline, about keeping the show's ownership structure simple, about maintaining creative control even when more complex arrangements might have been financially beneficial. Those decisions look like creative stubbornness in the moment. In October 2019, they look like foresight. The ban remains in effect. South Park has made no effort to apologize or seek reinstatement in the Chinese market. As of 2026, the show is still effectively non-existent in China through official channels and has been for about 7 years. Banned in China was within South Park's production schedule, just another episode of a season. It aired, it caused a seismic international response, and the following week they made another episode. The speed of it, the complete absence of the long institutional discussion that would precede most studios' decisions to do something this provocative, is itself a reflection of how South Park works. By the time anyone could have told them to think harder about the consequences, it was already done. There's a slightly philosophical dimension to the China story that doesn't always get noticed. The Chinese government's response, total deletion, no dialogue, no formal complaint, just removal, was in a sense the purest version of the censorship that South Park had been satirizing for its entire run. No negotiation, no attempt to have the offending content edited or adjusted, no letter of inquiry, no ratings board ruling, no advocacy group campaign, just gone. Every other institution the show had fought with over the years had operated through some kind of process. The MPAA had a board that you could submit your film to repeatedly. The FCC had procedures. The Catholic League issued press releases and organized letter-writing campaigns. Even Comedy Central's censorship of 201 was communicated, however imperfectly and however late, to the people whose work was being altered. There was a conversation, even if the conversation was one-sided. China didn't have a conversation. China simply stopped carrying the information. The show was there on Monday. By the end of the week, it wasn't. No one at South Park Studios received a formal communication explaining what had happened or what, if anything, could be done about it. The deletion was the entire message. Parker and Stone's statement was, in this context, the only available response. They couldn't appeal to a process that didn't exist. They couldn't submit a revised version for reconsideration. They could only say what they thought about what had happened and accept whatever came next. What came next was the ban staying in place indefinitely. The show continued. China is not the only country that has had a difficult relationship with South Park. The show has been banned or restricted in a number of markets over its run, and the reasons vary enough that looking at them together produces a kind of interesting portrait of what different societies find specifically intolerable versus merely distasteful. India is the one that surprises people most when they hear it. South Park was banned in India in 2010 by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The stated reason was extreme vulgarity. A broad category, but apparently one the show satisfied comprehensively enough that the ban was immediate and total. This was not a single episode complaint or a regulatory warning. It was the whole show. Gone. India in 2010 was and remains one of the world's largest English-language media markets. South Park had been on the air for 13 years by that point. And the thing I keep thinking about when I consider the Indian ban is that it happened with no specific triggering event. No one episode, no one joke that went too far. The ministry looked at the show as a whole, decided it was too vulgar to be available, and that was that. A policy decision about an entire body of work held for nearly a decade. The situation changed in 2019 when Netflix India acquired streaming rights to the show. The episodes became accessible again, rated 18+ for adult content. So South Park returned to India through a streaming platform with an age restriction, almost a decade after it had been removed, which is a strange little arc. Banned by a government ministry, restored by a tech company. That sequence feels very contemporary in a way that probably tells you something about who has cultural authority now and who doesn't. The timing is interesting to sit with. The Indian ban covered the entire period of the 200/201 controversy, the Catholic League campaign, and the early seasons of the China situation. India didn't respond to any specific episode. It made a blanket policy decision about the whole show and held it for 9 years without revisiting it. There's something almost old-fashioned about that compared to the episode-by-episode drama playing out everywhere else. Australia's situation is more complicated and more episodic. The Steve Irwin issue in Hell on Earth 2006 was one moment of friction. The video game situation, which we'll get to in a minute, was another. And the regulatory body, the Australian Broadcasting Services Acts and related legislation, creates a system where individual episodes can be formally reviewed and found to be in violation of standards. Bloody Mary, the Virgin Mary episode from season 9, never aired in its intended form on some Australian networks. New Zealand's formal finding against it, which we discussed earlier, created pressure in the Australian market too. Some channels aired it, some didn't, and the regulatory picture was uneven enough that different Australian viewers had different experiences of the show's availability. Australia also had a specific relationship with South Park in the early years because Australian broadcasting standards were enforced at the network level in ways that created practical complications. The country's classification system, which applies to television content as well as film and games, gave regulators real tools to apply to individual episodes. When those tools were used, as they were in various cases over the years, the result was that South Australian, Queensland, and New South Wales viewers might see different versions of a program, or none at all, depending on the network and the regulatory environment at the time. This created a slightly strange situation where the same episode of South Park existed in multiple states simultaneously. aired in one Australian market, not aired in another, available online regardless, and generating different levels of public discussion depending on where you were. The internet gradually flattened these differences, but in the early 2000s, Australian audiences had a meaningfully different experience of South Park's availability than their counterparts in the US or UK. There is also the broader fact that South Park has circulated primarily through unofficial channels in a number of countries where no legal broadcast arrangement has existed. The show was simply never licensed to air in some markets, which made the question of what's banned and what's just unavailable a bit murkier. In countries where the show exists only through informal downloading and file sharing, the experience of South Park is necessarily different. No broadcast schedules, no edited versions, no regulatory oversight, just the episodes. The video game situation deserves its own few paragraphs because it's one of those stories that when you hear it, feels too specifically South Park to be real, and yet is entirely documented. In 2014, a long-awaited South Park role-playing game was finally released. South Park, The Stick of Truth, had been in development for several years and was genuinely ambitious. It was a full RPG developed with Parker and Stone's direct involvement, with the same animation style, voice cast, and humor as the show. It was, by most reviews, excellent. It won multiple Game of the Year awards, but not in Australia, Europe, or Israel. In those markets, 2 specific sequences were altered or removed before the game could be sold. The first was an alien abduction sequence that involved anal probing, a direct reference to the very first episode of the show, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which had been part of the show's DNA since 1997. The sequence had interactive elements that the Australian Classification Board found unacceptable under their guidelines. The second was a sequence set in an abortion clinic, which also had interactive elements the board found in violation of classification standards. Rather than making changes that would alter the game's content significantly, the publishers released those markets a version with the relevant sequences replaced by a static image. The image showed a black screen with text on it. The text described in plain terms what the player was missing. It apologized for the absent content. The apology text was written in South Park's voice. It was dry, slightly absurdist, and quite funny. It acknowledged that the Australian Classification Board had required these changes. It expressed mild regret. It told the player to imagine the experience they were not having. Several gaming publications noted that the replacement text itself was better, or at least more interesting, than what it was replacing. Others pointed out that games censored for Australian markets frequently make the uncensored version more desirable and accessible than they would have been otherwise, which is the same dynamic that had operated with South Park on television for 20 years. The game still won awards in the censored markets. The specific sequences that were removed were available on other platforms without restriction. The Australian Classification Board's decision accomplished essentially the same thing as most of the other censorship decisions in this story. It generated coverage, it made the censored content slightly more famous, and it did not meaningfully prevent anyone from accessing it. There are a handful of other countries where South Park has had formal bans or restrictions, some in the Middle East, some in parts of Southeast Asia. The common thread is usually either the Muhammad content, which we've already covered at length, or general vulgarity standards that the show simply doesn't clear. None of this is surprising. A show this consistently crude was always going to have a complicated international life. What's genuinely striking, though, is how little any of it slowed the show down. For most of its run, South Park was either banned in a market or not, and in either case, it kept making the same show. No episode was adjusted for international distribution. No joke was softened to secure access somewhere. The show that existed was the show, full stop. This is not how most television operates. Most television is produced with at least some awareness of the markets it needs. South Park never seemed to factor that in at all, and the reason it could afford not to is straightforward. The US audience was more than enough. Being banned in India for 9 years, or restricted in Australia, or partially unavailable across the Middle East. Those losses were real, but they were never existential. Parker and Stone were not in a position where they had to choose between saying what they wanted and keeping a foreign deal intact. That freedom, small and structural as it sounds, is what made the show's creative posture possible over 3 decades. The streaming era has made this geography more complicated in ways that aren't fully resolved. When South Park moved to Paramount Plus as its streaming home, it brought with it most of its archive. But not all of it. The 5 Muhammad episodes remain absent. Whether future streaming arrangements in other markets will restore content that was restricted in broadcast contexts or impose new restrictions on content that was previously available is an ongoing question that the show's history doesn't quite prepare you to answer. The rules for streaming are different from the rules for cable, which were different from the rules for broadcast. Each transition has produced a slightly different map of what's available where and to whom, which is what makes Banned in China comprehensible as a decision, and what makes it distinct from what we see from most of Hollywood. There are a handful of things in South Park's history that aren't quite scandals, don't quite fit the category of controversy that resulted in something, but that sit in the same neighborhood and are worth spending some time on before we start to wind down. Let's start with an episode that I think is genuinely underrated in terms of how it handled a sensitive subject. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, aired in March of 2007, opening season 11. The inciting event is Randy Marsh. Of course, Randy Marsh. At this point, he's involved in almost everything, going on Wheel of Fortune and solving a puzzle correctly, but in the process, guessing the N-word out loud on television in front of the whole country. The episode's exploration of this isn't what you'd expect from South Park. It doesn't try to be edgy about the word itself. That was a different episode from a different era. What With Apologies to Jesse Jackson is actually about is the question of who gets to be offended, who gets to forgive, and what it means to understand that a word causes harm when you've never experienced the harm it causes. Token, the only black character in the main school group, whose name is itself a joke the show eventually addressed in its own way, is genuinely deeply hurt by what Randy did. Stan wants to make it right. He keeps trying to express to Token that he gets it, that he understands why it was wrong, that he fully comprehends the weight of what happened. Token's response throughout the episode is a very calm, very clear, no you don't. Stan doesn't get it. Not because he's a bad person, he's sincerely trying, but because understanding something from the outside is not the same as knowing it from the inside. The episode ends without Stan arriving at the understanding he's seeking. That's unusual for a television episode. Most resolutions involve the earnest character having a moment of genuine insight. Stan doesn't get one. The episode closes with him still trying. Token is still right that Stan doesn't fully understand. Both things remain true, and the show just leaves it there. Jesse Jackson does appear in the episode as a character. He accepts Randy's apology on behalf of all black people, in a way that itself is a joke about the mechanics of public apology and forgiveness, and who has standing to grant absolution. It's one of those moments where the comedy and the actual argument are doing the same work simultaneously. Some critics at the time wrote positively about the episode's treatment of the subject. The show received some criticism too, mostly around the mechanics of how it was done. But something I don't think gets said enough. South Park occasionally made episodes that were genuinely trying to work through something difficult and arrived at an honest place. Not every episode that caused discomfort was simply being careless. Now, an entirely different kind of story. Parker and Stone at the Oscars. In March of 2000, the Academy Award ceremony was held in Los Angeles. Parker and Stone had been nominated for Best Original Song for Blame Canada from Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. They attended. They arrived at the ceremony in full drag. Floor-length dresses, wigs, makeup. Parker wore a white dress. Stone wore a green one. They have said in interviews that they also took LSD before attending, though this is one of those claims that is a little difficult to fully verify. They did not win. You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan, composed by Phil Collins, won that year. Parker and Stone accepted this in stride. I mention this not because it was a scandal, it really wasn't, or at least not the kind that leaves lasting consequences, but because it's a useful data point about who these two people are. They had just made a film that had gone 6 rounds with the MPAA. Their show was being attacked by parents' groups on a monthly basis. The Catholic League was already watching them. The Parents Television Council had them in their sights. And their response to being invited to the most prestigious event in American cinema was to get dressed up, get very stoned, and enjoy themselves enormously. There's a kind of person who takes their own controversies very seriously, who sees each fight as a momentous battle, who carries the weight of their opponent's objections as evidence that what they're doing matters deeply. Parker and Stone have never really been those people. They make the show, they take the fights as they come, and then they go to the Oscars in dresses, and then there's Scott Tenorman Must Die. Scott Tenorman Must Die aired in July 2001, early in season 5. It is not a banned episode. It has never been pulled. No organization mounted a campaign against it. It is, by many critics' assessments, one of the best episodes of the show. A dark, tightly constructed piece of television that escalates cleanly to an ending that is shocking and then, on reflection, perfectly structured. Cartman is humiliated by an older boy named Scott Tenorman, who is in 8th grade. Cartman's attempts to get revenge keep failing. Eventually, Cartman engineers a situation in which Scott Tenorman's parents are killed. He then makes Scott Tenorman eat them, in chili, while Radiohead, having been invited to the event under false pretenses, stand nearby watching Scott Tenorman cry and telling him they find him very unimpressive. The episode is devastating, and it was acclaimed. It has appeared on lists of the best TV episodes of its year. It deepened the character of Cartman in a way that changed how the show understood him. Not just a rude, selfish child, but genuinely, functionally sociopathic, in a way that would run through his character for the next 2 decades. No one protested it in any organized way. No regulatory body looked at it. No parents group made it their cause. It just aired and was praised. And this is something I find worth sitting with. South Park has been in serious, sustained fights over episodes that were trying to make arguments about censorship, about religion, about who is allowed to be made fun of. It has had organizations spend years trying to remove content that had a point underneath it. And meanwhile, one of its most famous episodes involves a child feeding his parents to their son in chili. And the world basically said, impressive television. What we choose to organize around and what we don't is genuinely interesting. The things that get formal complaints tend to be the things that touch on identity, belief, and institutional power. The things that are just dark and strange and well-constructed tend to slip through. I don't think there's a clean conclusion to draw from that. It's just a pattern worth noticing. South Park's later seasons also involve some quieter shifts that are worth a mention. By season 19 in 2015, the show introduced a character called PC Principal, a new school principal who represents a certain kind of progressive campus culture, enthusiastically applying politically correct standards to the point of absurdity. The episode introducing him was called Stunning and Brave. The arc generated criticism from people who felt South Park was punching down at progressive values, and that framing earnest attempts at social progress as cartoonishly absurd was itself a political act. It also generated appreciation from viewers who felt the show was honestly poking at the mechanics of how certain conversations get policed. Both groups were watching the same episodes. What's interesting about PC Principal as a character is what the show eventually did with him. He was introduced as a target, as an object of satire. Over the following seasons, he became something more complicated. He had relationships, he had vulnerabilities. He cared about things, sometimes in ways that were misguided and sometimes in ways that were right. The show didn't fully condemn him or fully vindicate him. He just became a person in the world of the show, which is a more honest way to handle a satirical target than most shows manage. By season 22 and 23, Randy Marsh Integrity Farms had taken over the show's primary focus. The show's political engagement continued but felt, to some viewers, less sharp than it had been. Parker and Stone have said they found the increasingly polarized political environment harder to write around. When every issue has been fully sorted into two camps before you've made the episode, the space for genuine satire is different. South Park's best work tends to happen in the space between clearly defined sides, in the territory where both positions have something valid and something absurd in them simultaneously. When the culture doesn't leave much room in the middle, the show's particular skill set has less to grab onto. In a 2019 episode, Cartman said, essentially directly to the audience, that the show was trying to phase out gay jokes. The show's new executive producers confirmed this was a real shift in direction. That's a long way from a production assistant sitting in a room counting profanity for a tally. It's a long way from the credits rolling under John Smith and Jane Smith. But it's also not a betrayal of anything. It's a show that's been running since 1997 and has actually changed over time, which is something fewer shows manage than you'd think. There's one more thing I want to mention before we close, and it doesn't fit neatly anywhere else, but feels important to say. In November 1999, Mary Kay Bergman died. She was 38 years old. Bergman was a voice actress who had provided the majority of the female character voices in South Park since the beginning. Leanne Cartman, Sheila Broflovsky, Sharon Marsh, the school counselor, and several others. She had recorded hundreds of lines across the show's first two seasons and was, in a real sense, one of the foundational voices of the show's world. She died by suicide on November 11th, 1999. South Park was in its third season. The show continued. Bergman's roles were redistributed to other voice actresses, Eliza Schneider initially, then later April Stewart and Mona Marshall, who have continued in those roles since. The show has never formally addressed Bergman's death within the show's world. It's one of those things that exists in the space between the show and the reality of the people who made it. I raise it not as a scandal or a controversy. It wasn't either of those things. But because the show's history includes not just the fights it picked and the institutions it antagonized, but the real people who were part of it. Mary Kay Bergman voiced the Mothers of South Park for 2 years. Her contribution to the show's early sound is significant and not often acknowledged. The show has dedicated episodes to her memory. The Season 3 episode Jubilee included a dedication in the credits. It was quiet, one line, but it was there. Kenny's deaths, and this feels like a natural place to spend a few minutes since we've been in and around this show's history all night, are one of the things that looks simple and isn't. For the first several seasons, Kenny dying was a running gag. He died in almost every episode. He'd be hit by something, fall from somewhere, be killed by something absurd, and then the next episode he'd be back with no explanation. Stan would say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle would say, "You bastards." And then it was over, and the episode moved on. The show never explained it for years. It didn't need to. The joke worked as a joke. Then, around season 14, Parker and Stone started filling in the mythology. During the Coon and Friends trilogy, episodes where the boys form a superhero group, it came out that Kenny was Mysterian, a superhero whose power was that he couldn't die. Not metaphorically, literally. He had been killed hundreds of times. He always came back. Nobody remembered it happening. He demonstrated this to his friends by shooting himself in the head. They were horrified. The next day, he was back, alive and well, and none of them remembered. The explanation for the curse came from Kenny's parents. They had, years earlier, attended a meeting of a cult called the Cult of Cthulhu. The reason they went? Free beer. Kenny has been condemned to an eternity of dying and being reborn because his parents wanted free beer. This is, if you let it land, genuinely dark. Not dark in the way South Park is usually dark, rude, irreverent, transgressive, dark in a quieter way. Here's a child trapped in an endless loop of death and resurrection, alone with the knowledge of it, unable to make anyone else understand what's happening to him. The dying isn't even the worst part. The loneliness is. And the show found this mythological depth in a joke that had been running for 7 years without any explanation at all. It didn't contradict the earlier episodes. It recontextualized them. Every Kenny death you'd laughed at in the early seasons was, retroactively, also a small tragedy that nobody noticed. I find that genuinely impressive. Not every show can take 7 years of a running gag and turn it into something that means something. South Park managed it with Kenny, and it managed it while still being South Park. Still crude, still funny, still completely committed to not being reverent about anything, including its own moments of unexpected depth. I've been thinking about this show for a long time tonight, and I think the thing I keep coming back to is how strange it is that it's still here. Not strange as in unlikely. The show has earned its longevity in measurable ways. The ratings, the awards, the streaming deals, the video games, the cultural footprint that extends into places the show has never officially aired. It has survived every fight we've talked about tonight and a dozen more. It will probably keep going. But strange in this way, most of the institutions that tried to stop it have moved on. The Parents Television Council is still around, but is a quieter force than it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The FCC's authority over cable content was never as significant as its broadcast authority, and the media landscape has shifted so much that the old regulatory frameworks barely describe what television is anymore. The specific celebrity feuds have faded. The Catholic League campaign over Bloody Mary belongs at this point to a different era. South Park outlasted all of them, not by being clever about it, by simply continuing to exist and refusing to treat any of the fights as existential. Parker and Stone seemed to have decided very early on that the show they wanted to make was the show they were going to make, and that whatever the consequences of that were, the consequences were more interesting than the alternative. And I think there's something in that worth holding on to, separate from any judgment about whether any particular episode was tasteful or useful or fair. There is a particular kind of creative persistence that involves deciding what you believe, making the thing that reflects it, and then just continuing to make it regardless of what comes back at you. Most shows that do this don't last 28 years. South Park seems to have found the specific combination of financial independence, production speed, creative ownership, and genuine conviction that made the persistence sustainable. It also helps probably that Parker and Stone seem to have found the fights interesting rather than exhausting. There's a difference between a creative person who gets into fights because they're careless and one who gets into fights because they're genuinely curious about where the lines are and why they're there. Parker and Stone have always seemed, even in their most provocative moments, to be operating from curiosity rather than recklessness. They wanted to know what would happen. They wanted to test whether the things people said were off-limits really were. They wanted to find out whether the institutions claiming authority over what could be said actually had the power to enforce it. The answers, in most cases, turned out to be, not really. The government could be criticized. Celebrities could be parodied. Religions could be satirized, corporations could be mocked, foreign governments could be angered, and the show would still be there the following week with a new episode, made in 6 days, ready to find out what was next. The 5 banned episodes are still banned. The Chinese internet still doesn't have the show. India has it back on a streaming platform with an age restriction. Isaac Hayes' recordings sit in a digital archive. Chef's been dead for almost 20 years. And 4 kids are still at a bus stop in South Park, Colorado, talking about whatever's happened since last week. If you've drifted off somewhere in the last couple of hours, that's completely fine. You don't need to have caught all of it. The scandals will still be there in the morning. They're well documented. And if you're still awake, well, now you know more about South Park's fight with the entire world than most people do, which is the kind of thing you can carry quietly with you, even if you're not sure exactly what to do with it. Good night. Sleep well. See you next time.